Hello viewers, welcome back. In hindsight, I'm glad I ran out of time to finish Eternal Summer for last month's review. While one does flow right into the other, Season 2 does also have its own pretty distinct story, and something definitely would have been left out or rushed if I'd tried to discuss everything in one review. Because I do plan to go into spoiler territory for this season as well. On that note, if you haven't seen Free, or at least my review of Free, I suggest you go check that out first. If you're all caught up, then let's jump right in, because there's a lot I want to cover. About a year has passed since Season 1's end, and the boys are getting ready for tournament season again, and for Haru, Rin, and Makoto, this will be their last year. This means a few different things for our characters. On the Iwatobi side of things, this means the race is on to build up the swim team's reputation and recruit new members, because if they don't, they won't have enough members to compete once Haru and Makoto graduate. And because this sort of storyline is a little choppy and made up of mostly mini-adventures, a lot of the focus early on switches over to Samezuka, where Rin is appointed as the swim team's new captain. And not to derail into a character discussion so soon, but I guess that's kind of inevitable with a show like this one that's all about the characters. One of the biggest changes for me in Season 2 is that Rin has changed drastically, and so my opinion of him has changed drastically. I mean, I stand by all my judgments of the way he acts in Season 1, but in hindsight there is one scene that I didn't bring up in my last review that I'd like to discuss now. Free was very flashback heavy from the very first episode, but most of those flashbacks didn't have a lot of substance. They mostly just existed to hammer home the point of, hey look, these four have history. The exception being the first half of episode 10, where we finally get the mostly complete story of Rin transferring to their elementary school. For me, it felt like the first instance of getting to see young Rin as more than just Haru's rival, and the effect was really striking. Rin was so open and easygoing and charismatic as a child. He bears practically no resemblance to his teenage self, and for the first time I felt like I really understood why this change affected his old friends to the extent that it did, and why they were so dedicated to helping him. In fact, if they'd shown this scene a little earlier in the season, rather than right before he was about to see the light anyway, I get the feeling that I might have been a little more sympathetic towards Rin's character, even acting the way he did. But Rin does see the light, and is now all about the power of friendship, and most importantly, he wants to put together the best relay team Samezuka's ever had, which extends the spotlight to 3 more characters. First is Aichiro Nitori, who was around in the first season. I just didn't really have a reason to talk about him. He was Rin's roommate last year, and was basically just this younger kid who really looked up to Rin and admired his swimming. I have read that his entire character was kind of an afterthought, because the creator wanted something to balance out all of Rin's angst. So maybe it's a little fitting for Nitori to be overlooked, but he really comes into his own in Season 2, working hard to get good enough to be included in Rin's relay team. And I have to say, for a character who was kind of just there for Season 1, I found I was really attached to Nitori by the end of Season 2. Then there's Sosuke Yamazaki. He's Rin's first rival and oldest friend, since even before his days with the Iwatobi boys. He transfers to Samezuka for his last year of high school so he can swim with Rin again, one last time. There's a lot more to Sosuke, but honestly, his story kind of happens outside of the actual story, so I'll come back to him. Last is Momotaro Mikoshiba, the younger brother of last year's captain. Of our 8 main characters, he's the only one who doesn't really get any depth, like at all, but that's okay. I love Momo. He's enthusiastic about absolutely everything, and he is very quickly won over by this idea of the miracle of the relay race and the power of friendship. He was just a lot of fun, and frankly, in this season where even Nagisa gets his fair share of angst, we needed a character like Momo. And I did mostly get the feeling that the seasons blend right into each other because the most important part about Free was the character development, and in that regard Eternal Summer picks up right where Season 1 left off. Last season, if there were any characters who were kind of overlooked, it was Makoto and Nagisa. They both played their parts in the story, but weren't really given any opportunities to grow as characters, and Eternal Summer gets on fixing that right away. Early on, the boys are faced with another problem, where Nagisa may have to quit the team if he can't get his grades up. This sounds like a very simple, mundane problem, but they really turn it into something special. He talks about how his parents are really strict about that sort of thing, and how he lost touch with them in the first place because he was sent to a really rigorous prep school for junior high. His problem was basically that there was no balance. He did nothing but study until he couldn't even bring himself to care about that anymore. I really liked that this was the angle the writers decided to pursue with him, because it's not hard to see why an atmosphere like this would be particularly damaging for a character like Nagisa, who's always so cheerful and energetic. He got to be so depressed that his parents agreed to let him transfer back to Iwatobi for high school, where the first thing on his mind was getting to swim with his friends again. So he got them to start their club, and here we are, but the way they wrapped his story back around was really interesting to me. I mentioned in my last review that there was almost this side plot of Haru starting to realize how important swimming was to his friends, too. And that's continued here, except this time I was the one caught off guard, so props to the writers for that. Maybe it was because this show has been so friendship-focused up to this point, but somewhere along the way I did lose sight of it being swimming that they all really care about. They are friends, but you couldn't just plop them down into any other sport or activity and expect it to be exactly the same. They've all had experiences in the water that have given them an individual claim on the sport, and I don't think this was more apparent with anyone than with Makoto, who finally gets his chance to shine in the second half of Eternal Summer. This review has been all character discussion so far, but the plot finally picks back up in the second half of the season when their impending graduation can't be ignored any longer. For Rin, who's had his eyes on the Olympics since he was a kid, this isn't really a big deal, but for Haru and Makoto this means they finally have to start making some decisions about their future. Haru has been adamant this whole time about only swimming because he wants to. He's not out there to break records and make a name for himself, but of course he catches the attention of a bunch of scouts anyway. So despite his best efforts, the pressure starts building up as seemingly everyone around him, Rin in particular, assumes that of course he's going to go on and swim for some college team and pursue swimming professionally. Which was really frustrating from a viewer's standpoint, because he's made it pretty clear that this was never his plan. Though in their defense, he's not making any other plans either, so I can see why they might want to think this way. I know I led into this talking about Makoto, so not to make things more convoluted than they have to be, but this is where Sosuke comes back into the picture. Because he seems to be the only one who's aware that Haru isn't as serious about this as everyone thinks he is. More specifically, as serious as Rin is, and he's known this since day one. He warns Haru very early on that he wants him to stop getting in Rin's way, not pull any more stunts like the one that got them disqualified at the last regionals. My first impression were that the writers were definitely trying to introduce a new, edgy character as a replacement now that Rin is on good terms with everyone again, but it was exactly because Rin has changed so much that I tried not to jump to conclusions with Sosuke, and really that isn't who he is. It's not that he's out to cause problems for the others, it's just that he doesn't want anyone to cause problems for Rin. I mentioned that his story kind of happens outside of the main story, but really it's that most of his story has already happened by the time he's introduced in Eternal Summer. Remember that Sosuke is Rin's oldest friend, his first rival. Back when they were kids, he didn't have a problem with Rin leaving to go build a relay team with the Iwatobi kids because, though they were both very good individually, they didn't work well together as a team. Sosuke wasn't crazy about swimming with a team, period. He didn't want to be responsible for anyone's success or failure but his own. He's one of those characters who looks all big and intimidating but is actually really nice, but he is very intense also. When Reen left for Australia, he set his sights on meeting him in competition again one day and worked himself as hard as he could. Overworked himself, in fact. By his first year in high school, he damaged his shoulder past the point where he could compete, in part because he wouldn't rest long enough to recover fully. So by the time Eternal Summer starts, he's already come to terms with giving up his dream of competing professionally. But he went to the regional tournament last year, saw Reen's breakdown and then recovery with his old team, and his dream changed. He decided he wanted to swim with Reen again and try to find for himself whatever it was that made Reen so happy swimming as part of a team. So he transfers to Samezuka for his last year and is, of course, enlightened as to the power of friendship through their relay race. And I have to give Free this much credit. It doesn't actually come across being as cheesy as I've made it sound. It's not hard to get caught up in the moment yourself. But once he's found himself, Sosuke goes back to trying to impress upon Haru just how important he is to Reen's dream, being his rival. The pressure gets to a point where, for the first time ever, Haru just doesn't want to swim. He can't enjoy it anymore, constantly being told he has to enjoy it a certain way and want certain things out of his future. For most of this struggle, Makoto holds back, waiting for Haru to figure things out for himself. But he's figuring out his own future in the meantime, and he really grows a lot in the process. At the start of the season, Makoto doesn't have any real plans either, stating that he'll probably just go to the local university and try to figure things out from there, but he helps out as a part-time instructor for a while at his old swim club, helping teach the younger kids. He really connects with the boy who almost drowned when he was younger, and helps him to get over his fear of the water, explaining how he used to be afraid too, and the whole reason he favors backstroke now is because it allows him to look up at the sky while he swims. And he decides this is what he wants to do with his life. He tells Haru that all he really wanted to do was swim too, but he didn't think he was good enough for real competition, and now he's found his place. He's going to help little kids find their love of swimming. And Makoto's character arc really stood out to me. Being the nice friend, he's the one the most in danger of being overlooked, which I found I was also guilty of. Like I said, it's not just that swimming is Haru's thing and his friends swim just to spend time with him. They all love swimming too, for their own reasons. I mean, I like what they did with Makoto in part because his plans for the future are just so fitting for his character, but I also felt he had a really powerful story. To go from being afraid of the water to swimming being the one thing he's most passionate about. Honestly, I wish we got to see more of that than we did, but Makoto plays another important role in this story. When it finally becomes apparent that Haru's not figuring things out on his own, Makoto confronts him. They have their first fight ever, and ultimately Reen ends up taking Haru to Australia to meet his old host family and show him that it's a big world out there, and he shows him the pool where the national team trains. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm really torn about the way Eternal Summer ends. Haru returns in time for nationals and lets them all know that he's decided he is going to go for it for real. And on the one hand, I can really appreciate how much he's had to grow to get to a point where he can acknowledge that the reason he hasn't cared about times and winning or losing all these years is that he's been afraid of what that pressure would do to the experience, because I think it's pretty safe to say he treats swimming as an escape. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't disappointed. In making this Haru's dream, I feel like they lost one of the most important things about Free. I feel like the differing perspectives aspect of this story between Reen and Haru really defined this show. I really liked that message of there being more than one right way to love something, and I loved the basis of Haru's character, this prodigy who had no interest in proving he was the best. And I probably wouldn't be this disappointed, except that it feels like Haru not finding his own path was just a mistake on the writer's part. It's not that it's just some unfortunate hard truth of his character that Haru was just never going to be capable of doing anything but swimming for a living. The writers themselves don't even try to make that claim. There's a really nice little scene with Nagisa where he tells Haru that he's actually good at a lot of things and he could probably do anything he set his mind to. The fact that he doesn't find some other passion and preserves swimming to be this part of his life untouched by everything else, it just dragged the ending down for me a bit. So, as I'm sure you can tell by now, I've thrown any hope of keeping this review to a reasonable length completely out the window. We've gotten this far. There's no going back now. It probably goes without saying that I fell in love with Free. Everyone has those stories that really strike a chord with them. And no, it's not just the shipping and the fan service, though that's been fun too. I love stories that are all about the characters. I love that this story could introduce 3 more important characters without becoming a cluttered mess. At the end of the day, everyone got their moment to shine, and everyone ended up being really likable. I mentioned Momo not really getting any depth, but even there it didn't feel like he was really overlooked, just that he had a different part to play. If there was one aspect that sometimes fell short across both seasons, it was the pacing. Not with the character stories, it's very clear where the focus was creatively, but the time between tournaments often felt a little rushed, like there wasn't enough build-up to them. And ironically, during episode 10, I realized why that might be. Everyone loves to complain about being manipulated by cliffhangers, but it was often the absence of a cliffhanger that could make Free so overwhelming at times. Most of episode 10 is dedicated to giving us Sosuke's backstory, and then, at the end of that emotional roller coaster, we jump right into the big Iwatobi vs. Samezuka relay that this whole season has been building up to, like without any time to process anything. And this was certainly a show that loved to tug at your heartstrings. I realize that all of these little things can be very subjective, but apparently I was exactly the right audience. There were the little things, like Haru just ceasing to function after his first fight with Makoto. My own best friend and I have been together for 14 years now, and if we ever had the type of argument that wasn't resolved in that same meeting, I can only imagine feeling exactly the same way. And then, of course, there were the bigger connections, the ones that made me glad I never got a handle on my procrastination. Eternal Summer came out the year I graduated high school. It was stressful watching this now. If I'd had to deal with the characters I rely on for an escape struggling to figure out what they wanted to do with their lives while I was experiencing that struggle myself, I would probably still be mid-existential crisis to this day. I know I've discussed in the past that I tend to watch a pretty even blend of subs and dubs. It's just that I only pick one voice cast per show and stick with it. And I don't usually bring up that choice unless I have something specific to comment on, and Free was in an interesting situation here. I watched Free in Japanese, a decision that was essentially made for me because early on it didn't look like Free would be getting an English dub. And then things got a little complicated. You see, Crunchyroll had the rights to Season 1, but Funimation got the rights to Eternal Summer, and this was before whatever deal they made that everyone was going crazy about last year. Eventually they did work something out, but they dubbed Season 2 first, which may be the reason behind the main complaint that I've heard. People tend to get so passionate about the subs versus dubs debate that I rarely listen to opinions on the subject, preferring to make my own. But what I've heard about the Free dub, mostly, is that it's not the acting fans don't like, but the dialogue, feeling like it's not true to the characters. This sounded to me like it could be a valid complaint, and though I try to give Funimation the benefit of the doubt, I can understand how this might have happened, knowing that they started mid-story with Season 2. But I also have to stress that I have not watched the dub, and have no plans to, so I urge you to come to your own conclusions. Free is quickly becoming one of those shows that I just can't seem to move on from. I mean, this is eased a little by the promise of a Season 3, which I am now more curious about than ever, and the knowledge of the movies that I still have not seen, but this is exactly why I struggled to meet my review deadlines to begin with, because I would just rewatch the ones I loved over and over rather than seeking out something new. I've found that it's a matter of reshaping that love so it can make its presence known without overshadowing the others. But those loves never really leave. So on the bright side, should you only come across this review years later, I will probably still be up to gushing or ranting about the story and characters. But if you've reached the end of this review now and you haven't seen Free yet, I suggest you do. Thank you for watching.